going to continue our program today, and our next presentation is going to be Integrating Effective Long-Term Planning Toward Infrastructure Funding Opportunities and Discussions on Military Expansion and Diversification Initiatives. And making the presentation for us is going to be none other than Tyrone Taitano. I know I have introduced him at a previous conference. Somebody that I often and fondly say is one of the smartest people on Guam. Love listening to his thoughts and his ideas. For the few people who don't know him, Tyrone is currently the Infrastructure Coordinator for the Office of Infrastructure and Policy and Development, a division within the Office of the Governor. He previously served as the Director of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans from 2018 to 2022. And he has spent really his entire professional career devoted to public service, both in the legislative and the executive branches. He's conducted extensive work for the legislative committees, pretty much all of them, Ways and Means, Health, Education, Environment, Federal Affairs. He's also held positions including Administrator of the Guam Memorial Hospital, General Manager of the Guam Mass Transit Authority, and Director of Policy and Development for a previous governor. Taitano is a graduate of FD and earned a bachelor's in Finance and Economics from the University of Guam. So here to make his presentation and to enlighten us all this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Tyrone Taitano.
Thank you, Ginger. You know, one of the great advantages of having Ginger as an MC is that she gives these wonderfully complimentary introductions. Of course, the downside of that is that I now have to live up to the introduction. Before we get to the presentation, I want to take this moment to congratulate BSB Director Lola Ningaro and her team for pulling off a fantastic and I believe really successful two-day symposium for the Assembly Planners Symposium. I've always said that that Lola and the staff at BSB are one of these underappreciated treasures of professionalism, expertise, and dedication in the government of Guam, and they certainly demonstrated that with pulling off this this two-day event. Yes, please give them a round of applause. I hope you're all still energized after that great lunch, because we are on slide one of a 66-slide presentation. Context is everything. That's an old axiom, and what the sense of what that conveys is that regardless of how many factoids and numbers and data points you're given, unless you sort of understand the context by which those numbers are arrived at and that information arrived at, you don't really get a full understanding of the subject matter. And so that came to mind as I was preparing this presentation. And one obvious way to do this was to give you all a recitation of list of federal programs and the congressionally approved funding amounts in the millions or the billions, and give you a list of possible projects, each with a dollar amount attached to it. But then I think at the end of it, I was giving you a mind-numbing list of numbers and not convey too much understanding of the process. And so for this presentation, I'm just going to kind of give you a broad sort of travelogue approach to the landscape and convey some sense of the framework in which decisions on infrastructure are and will continue to be made. And keep in mind, we're doing this in a situation that is rapidly evolving. For our own community, we're a community that is not only in recovery, but it's a community that is being transformed in the process of recovery. I mean, you saw some of that alluded to in some of the earlier presentations like zero waste, et cetera. And it's also indicated in the discussion of the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan. Also, even regarding the federal landscape, which is, of course, one of the compelling factors in this sort of subject of infrastructure, yesterday, Guam time, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which made available for Guam a whole host of infrastructure opportunities that weren't available the day before yesterday. And so now my staff is busy combing through that as well as other things just to get to the find out what those opportunities and to do it. And keep in mind, this is going to be sort of a slow process. One of the things here that's about a number of the federal initiatives is that a good many of the notice of funding opportunities have yet to be announced. particularly for the new programs. And this is because the feds themselves are trying to figure out what all this means. So given all those factors here, I think it's best to just sort of discuss the framework. Now first, next slide please. Now we'll start with my office. It was created by executive order by Governor Lilian Guerrero, and basically it's one of its main briefs is infrastructure policy. And it's coming again at a time of a lot of changing things, including concerns about supply chains and all the other, it's a time of, as Governor Leongo mentioned, a time of great opportunity, but we still have a number of ongoing challenges, and including not just the cover, but things like climate change, et cetera. And so what was needed to get a handle on all this was some process in which you could, given the multiple changes and multiple factors, and therefore come up with some sort of coherent approach that's comprehensive, not to mention a process to make sure that we don't miss any money that's available. And that is one of the governor's instructions to me, is to not leave any money on the table, to go after everything, regardless what the odds are, which is in the process of we're doing here. You know, and this sort of process, just to go back to the federal grants, is not so much, it's not like applying for food stamps, where you just submit your application, you qualify, you get it. Sometimes it's that easy, but not always. Particularly with the bulk of the federal opportunities are competitive grants. And you know, in that process, there are three steps on that. One, you have to identify the federal grant, which is not always easy to do, given the arcane nature of these grants. Two, you have to develop the project. And three, you get to the writing the grant. Now, of those three segments, writing the grant is the easiest. Figuring out what grant the opportunity is, that's hard. And developing the project takes a lot of work. And so this is the sort of thing that we're sort of working with various agencies to do so. You know, when I got this job, which is way back in April, my friends and family members tried to stylize me as the infrastructure czar. As a matter of fact, my sister Linda started combing Amazon looking for one of those Russian fur hats, you know, to get for me. And she decided it wasn't so funny after Putin invaded Ukraine. But in any event, I've sort of resisted that title for a couple things. One is, I still want people to call Vince Ariola about potholes rather than me. The second thing is, it's sort of misleading about really the task before us. When you take a look at infrastructure, it involves more than 20 local agencies, more than 100 federal programs. And it's sort of sprawling across various level of governances. Two of the major infrastructure agencies, for water and power, are not directly answerable to the governor. They answer to their own elected board. And so you have that range of complexity. Now, given that, it is not really set up for a hierarchical command structure, command and control structure. The only way to really do this effectively is by a more collaborative approach, working with the various agencies and try to find the synergies and find the connections and find the basis for where you can maximize these opportunities and for the best effect as possible with the community. So another briefer way of explaining it, what I do is that it's kind of like herding cats. Next slide, please. Now, part and parcel of our approach, we're going to do something that's kind of never been done before. We're going to try and create infrastructure policy and coordinate it with land use policy, or in this case, the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan, for which is that process has started now. If you think a lot about development issues on this island, particularly even regarding to public infrastructure, there always is this sort of missing element about doing these things here and coordinating with other things. I mean, one of the more recent examples was GPA building a generator next to Jose Rio School, in which case there was sort of two conflicting policies and interests here. But still, it's hopefully in the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan, you sort of resolve this sort of stuff. And so as we move infrastructure forward, it's infrastructure that meets fits the choices that are going to be in the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan, but also that supports the larger goals that plan is supposed to address, including not only economic factors like tourism, but issues like climate change and proper land use and conservation. So we're going to try and do that as part of this process of roping in all these various elements. and herding cats, as I mentioned. The other one we're trying to coordinate was economic policy. One of the goals the governor set forth in doing infrastructure is not just to build infrastructure that serves the needs of families and neighborhoods, but for which there are multiple impacts, particularly in support of economic policy initiatives. Quite often when we think of that in support of infrastructure sort of economic policy initiatives, it usually gets confined to tourism and usually gets confined to Tumon Bay. But we're trying to expand that in the broader landscape. The other thing is we're going to try and coordinate it with energy policy. Up to this point here, energy policy on almost separate channels has been set by GPA and also by the Guam Energy Office. GPA concentrating on production, Energy Office coming in a number of ways, including energy conservation. But it's been very clear here that you sort of need a sort of a stepped up approach to energy policy, particularly as reminded us by the sort of shocks in terms of high power rates and high gas rates. And in the outlook, it seems that may not be a glitch in the system. That may be a more reoccurring event than we would like, considering the long-range view of the disruptions in the global supply chain. So to give an example of areas in which we're doing this coordination, next slide, please. There are a number of diversification initiatives going on in the administration. And just to go down briefly, there's the development of industrial capacity. That, of course, will be dependent on a lot of supporting infrastructure as well for construction, labor, ship repair, and semiconductor manufacturing. By the way, for those of you who are wondering about that one and wondering if that's really a credible option here, for those of you who don't know, most of the world's semiconductors are made in Taiwan, whose future right now is, suffice to say, a little uncertain. And so there's a massive effort of diversifying semiconductor production, not only in the region, but a lot of reshoring to North America. So that is considered a realistic possibility, at least to pursue as a diversification option. Then there's healthcare, pharmaceutical manufacturing, that's an option, but also as a medical hub. And that speaks to plans for the new medical campus and the new hospital, very much infrastructure considerations. And then there are also expansion of local industries, including agriculture and aquaculture, and the circular economy. This is a subject that was covered by the zero waste presentation. The idea is you take waste, you convert it to resources to fuel a green economy. And a lot of that will be involved in supporting infrastructure as well. The other one is promoting international business participation. Most of this has to do with services and relies upon the fact that we're a U.S. territory under U.S. law. But some of the other stuff, particularly the last one, trans-shipment, does speak to infrastructure development, both private and public. And then there's this. The next slide, please. IT economic development and the proposal by Gita for a Silicon Village, basically to nurture tech-focused small businesses, in an incubator process, do IT learning centers, data centers and other tech companies, and tech-oriented nonprofits. Now, to actually that developed either in part or as a whole here, there will be two central considerations. One is broadband access, which is an infrastructure priority, and the other one is power. IT industries use a lot of power. So those things have, if this is to be realized even in segments, those two considerations are going to quickly come up to the forefront. Next slide. Then there's agriculture, aquaculture, and fisheries. There was a couple months ago, a conference in Honolulu convened by the Department of Interior in which they brought in all the federal infrastructure agencies, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, and a whole range of them. And there was one item they called build infrastructure, and they very quickly had to separate it to build infrastructure and green infrastructure, because green infrastructure is very much considered part of this, at least the federal outlook, on what is considered infrastructure priority. So just for example, build infrastructure for some of these industries. We have the ongoing effort for the Fishermen's Co-op. There are plans to build a slaughterhouse. And of course, water is crucial. for any agriculture and aquaculture activities. And in green infrastructure, particularly for fisheries, there are conservation issues or watershed management, and of course fish habitats as well. But conservation water management, of course, deal a lot with agriculture and aquaculture. Next slide, please. Then there's tourism. There is, as I said, traditionally, when discussions of infrastructure and tourism have largely centered on infrastructure for Tumon Bay, and that will still, to a sizable part, remain true as well. But there are other considerations as well, including destination management considerations, like, for example, the airport. A good deal of resources are invested in maintaining the airport, because as tourism comes back, that's the first thing tourists will see is our airport. And so resources are devoted to that. And as pointed out in a previous panel on tourism by Las Hill, there are other sectors in the island that are considered or hope to be developed as tourism centers, including the traditional Vista de Fagatna. Then there are considerations involving island-wide beautification to keep the island beautiful not only for those of us who live here, but for the tourists. And when you get into that, then you get into the discussions of reaching for the goal of universal trash collection as a way of dealing with illegal dumps. And there are considerations there as to how do you support that operation and staging of things like transportations, et cetera, to enable access to trash collection. There's also Governor Lulian Guerrero, as we get to the beginning of the cannabis industry, and the permits are supposed to be done by the end of this month, according to the statute. So we're getting very close to it. But the governor has committed the first $50 million in cannabis revenues for Tumon Bay infrastructure. There is also, in considerations of green infrastructure, including stuff that I always refer to as not only our environmental heritage, but in economic assets, particularly in our competitiveness as a tourist destination. So things like the marine preserves and coral reefs are definitely a target in terms of investment. Now, in energy policy, there are a number of drivers. First of all, there is, given high power rates and high gas rates, a renewed interest in renewable energy. Now, there's always been a strong interest, but I think it's come to the forefront now. And of course, a number of the infrastructure opportunities deal with renewable energy. And then there's energy conservation. If, when discussing the issue of lowering energy costs, energy conservation, having buildings refitted so they're more efficient in their energy usage, that we have appliances that are more efficient in their energy usage, has to be part of the solution moving forward. It can't all be solar farms. That has to be a certain part of the element, and that's been broadly recognized. And then there's electric vehicles. Governor Leon Guerrero was at a National Governors Association conference on infrastructure in Annapolis, Maryland last December. And in that, she sort of made news when she talked about the advantages of electric buses. And one of the local newspapers published a sort of, I thought, a short-sighted editorial, which said, well, we have more or less we have more important considerations, and this is a nice idea, and put it on the shelf. And what I found to be a major deficiency in that editorial is it did not recognize what was coming anyway. And electric vehicles is coming in the future, maybe quicker than some people realize, but it is coming. And so the challenge before us is whether we're going to prepare for that future or we're just going to let it happen to us. And I think it behooves us to take a more proactive step in preparing for the future electric vehicles that are coming. Not only also for the advantages of electric vehicles in terms of the environment and climate change, but as our power system shifts to more renewable sources. And in John Cruz's presentation during lunch, you saw they had their goals over the next couple of decades to reach renewable energy. If we have electric vehicles that feed off renewable energy here, that will help insulate us from high gas prices, because we'll be getting from electricity fueled by renewable energies. Anyway, that's the dream. But still, that indicates why that is an important priority. Next slide, please. Now we get to the part which I'm sure is the reason why most of you are here, where the money for this is coming from. And it has to, I think, probably, in my view, sort of divided into three parts. One is infrastructure spending from the government of Guam, either through earmarked revenues or direct appropriations or by leveraging for bonds, from the private sector as well, and by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. Now, a couple of things from Guam's contribution to this process to identify. One is, of course, it starts from revenues. Now, you've heard that the government of Guam budget is in surplus, and the deficit has been eliminated, so it's a very healthy foundation. But the other aspect of the story is that the budgeting process is sort of based on the economy we have now. And the fact of the matter is, tourism is on the rebound. It may take a couple years to get to full pre-COVID numbers, but it is clearly on the track to get there. And also, a big contributor to Guam's economy has been the military buildup. But because we were getting the new Guam defense system, that's going to be ratcheted up a notch. So the prospect for expanding revenues for not only investment infrastructure, but maintenance of this infrastructure are fairly bright, at least from the local government's perspective. And then there are bonds. I'm not sure we would actually get more bonds, but there are, by the way, a number of bonds that have already been floated for which they have not been fully expended. And then there are a couple of financing mechanisms already approved by the legislature, one for the medical campus and one for the new prison. So given this, if you take a look at the outlook and the planning for future infrastructure investment, clearly local government contributions have to take a sizable part of it. And then there's the private sector. Next slide. Now, particularly, we still got to take up broadband first. Traditionally on Guam, broadband and internet service has largely been left to the private sector. Now, some states have digital policies office. Guam has never had one until April, when the creation of the Infrastructure Policy and Development Office, and I meant to get it in the previous slide. One of given the nature of the job we do for infrastructure, we are not actually going to be applying for any grants. The relevant agencies are doing those grants. We're not going to actually be supervising any infrastructure. That'll be done by agencies like Public Works and GPA and Waterworks, et cetera. But the exception to that is broadband. The Infrastructure Policy and Development Agency has been designated as the agency to receive broadband funding and will to create a digital policy to do this. So we're getting, again, in the past, it's been largely left to the private sector, except when there's federal money available. There was, at the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, the Bureau was able to secure a $12 million grant from the NTIA for broadband investment. And there was, of course, if for those who recall in the Obama years, there was the ARA funding that also went to broadband. So that process is going to shape, but historically, it's largely private sector. And of course, we're all familiar with people who have been marketing solar panels, and they were as private businesses. So that's been a big part of that process. And moving forward, that's going to be a part of the process as well, as opposed to some direct massive projects. And again, something will be driving it is a lot of the tax credit and tax rebate programs out there to help fund or finance things like renewable energies and solar panels. Next slide. So that brings us to the U.S. government. And there are an endless number of federal programs, most of which are competitive funding. But there's an endless number of federal programs. But just to highlight the four main sources. One is Department of Defense, grants to the Department of Defense or its Office of Economic Adjustments are related to that. Then there's the American Rescue Plan that was passed last year. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed in November last year. And then there's the Infrastructure Reduction Act, which became law this week. Just to go over these three things, the American Rescue Plan was by and large COVID-related in terms of funding vaccines and the fight against COVID, but also assistance programs dealing with the PUA checks came from that. The stuff for the stimulus checks came from that. However, there was some portion of the money that was in infrastructure or infrastructure adjacent sort of things. For example, grants for the Economic Development Administration. was boosted by tenfold for just last fiscal year. It's normally $300 million a year, and it was boosted up to $3 billion a year. That attracted a lot of applicants, but that sort of put funnel money in the infrastructure pool, and for which Guam was able to tap, or was able to secure a portion of it so far. But there also were other pots of money. There was 14 money that's going for water infrastructure that's going to be used, I believe, for Attica subdivision. There's another 14 million that would go for a variety of projects, including UOG improvements, the Judicial Center, and for Chamorro Village. But most part, it was for service stuff. The bipartisan infrastructure law is the big one. It's the big pool of money, and I will get to that in sort of more detail. The Infrastructure Reduction Act has its own infrastructure opportunities. A lot of it is centered on climate change, but there's stuff here for park development based on combating climate change and greening the society. There is money in there to invest in weatherization and for water and energy efficient homes, and particularly affordable housing homes are particularly singled out. So there are elements in there for infrastructure as well, and some money specifically set aside for the territories. So, next panel, please. Now, like I said, there's a broad myriad of programs, and one just to sort of demonstrate it is this one, the Defense Community Infrastructure Pilot Program. Basically, it's a program to support infrastructure in civilian communities that sort of support operations. And one candidate for this that we thought would work here was GMH. And so recently, an application was sent in to this program for $15 million for a backup generator for GMH and others supporting power infrastructure. Now, we, as in a lot of competitive grant funding, you don't know from the outset whether you're going to get it or not. And quite often for things like these, there's a lot of competition. And I sort of bring this up just as sort of an example as to how sort of specific some of this stuff gets, as opposed to a general, come and get it, folks, sort of thing here. And these sort of things need a lot of time to research here and to develop the project for it. And then because you want to fill the federal standards and be as competitive as possible. Yes, next slide, please. Historically, Guam has gotten a lot of Defense Department grants, particularly in support of the military buildup stemming from the relocation of the Marines from Okinawa to Guam. And this is a list of a number of the projects, including stuff for the port, et cetera here. I want to draw your attention to the last two bullets there. One is $32 million for a Guam Biosafety Lab. This is the new public health lab. And the other one is the Cultural Repository. That's $12 million for the facility, and you see a picture of it now. It's up in the University of Guam. A total of just in recent years, $39.2 million in funding here. And as I said, because of the implementation of the Guam Defense System, which will be billions of dollars in investment, one of the issues that have to be dealt with is the increased demands that will be placed on supporting civilian infrastructure. One area is the port, of which 30% of the cargo already is military cargo. Another one is the road system. Now, based on published accounts, we'll know more over the next few months as the Missile Defense Agency finalizes its plans. But according to published accounts, the Guam Defense System, which is basically a ballistic missile defense system, will not be largely based on fixed installations, but instead on mobile launchers that will roll out to as many as 19 different sites around the island. Now, it probably won't be 19. A couple of sites will probably be used for administrative purposes. But the point is that that's how it will be deployed. When the alert comes, they'll hit the roads, and they'll go to their sites to do so. And which means the efficacy of Guam's roads are going to be consideration. Not to mention the strain of Guam's roads, because they will of course be practicing this at periodic basis, this sort of deployment. I am sort of brought to mind a distant memory for going back to that ancient time called the 1960s. And some of you who are of my age will remember this. This is at the height of the Vietnam War, and the B-52 bombing raids on Vietnam were stationed at Andersen Air Force Base. And they used to bring in the bombs in at the naval base, of course, and then truck them up to Andersen Air Force Base. Well, the bomb crates are open bomb crates. They're like frames. And so they used to put this on flatbed trucks with these open bomb crates with trains and drive them through Marine Drive in the middle of rush hour. Suffice to say, we sort of got used to it, but the tourists were freaked out a little bit. Anyway, that's the sort of future we sort of need to prepare from an infrastructure basis. Next slide. So now we come to the bipartisan infrastructure law and its funding. There's a couple features of it I just want to mention. A portion of it is formula funding. In other words, it's given to the states and the territories by formula based on population and other factors. But most of it is what's called discretionary funding or competitive funding, which means you have to compete for it. The other thing is note is that quite often, for the most part, there are specific ones, particularly pilot projects, where the instructions are you spend it until it's expired. But for the rest of it, not just the formative funds, but a good part of the discretionary funds, the funding has been appropriated over 5 years. And I sort of mention this point because one of the things that comes up in conversations is, well, what are you going to do when the federal money runs out? Well, it is going to decline since we're not going to do any PUA and stimulus checks anymore. But at least regarding infrastructure, it's not going to run out anytime soon. And we're going to have many more chances to bite at the apple. Next slide, please. So these are the categories of how they've identified categories of infrastructure in the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's roads and bridges, there's public transportation, there's airports, ports and waterways, electric vehicles, clean energy and power, water, resilience, and in this context, it's a lot of it is resource management, like for watersheds, but also includes FEMA funding to harden and protect facilities and communities from storms or any consequences from climate change. So it runs that range. Cybersecurity, a big issue, preparedness against cyber attacks. Environmental remediation. Basically, this refers to Superfunds and brownfield sites. There are 2 Superfund sites on Guam. One is on base, the other one is at ORDOT. But still, I think people at GPA have some plans of perhaps further remediation at ORDOT. But anyway, that's what the environmental remediation means. And then there's broadband. And so now we come to the question period. And are we all set up? The question is, let's see. The question is basically which infrastructure opportunity excites you or is your favorite. I guess that we have the code out there. And I know this sort of question is kind of like asking which one is your favorite child. But chime in and see what is the infrastructure army that most excites you and catches your attention, at least for today. So, everyone, if you're participating, cash it on the program to get your answer in, and let's see what the results are. And I'll let, is it done? Okay, and the clear winner is public transportation, yay! I'm terribly excited because in a previous life I was head of the Guam Mass Transit Authority. And once you're part of that one, you never quite leave it. In any event, there's the other ones are clean energy, power, and electric vehicles. I probably shouldn't be surprised that public transportation was picked in a conference where so much of the agenda is straight in sustainability. And I sort of will get to that when we get to those other items. But anyway, here's the categories of which they're sort of divided and where they're funded, not pretty much in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but it's also reflected in the American Rescue Plan infrastructure funding and also in the recent Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, next slide. Oh, there we go. So one of the edges that Guam has in securing some of the infrastructure funding, particularly on a competitive basis, is something that's called the Justice 40 Initiative, which has as its goal for 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments to underserved communities overburdened by pollution. And this in areas for climate change, clean energy, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, workforce to call back, by the way, to a previous panel discussion, workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, like Superfund sites, and development of critical clean water and wastewater infrastructure. So, you know, this is where the unfortunate fact that we have a substantial portion of our population under the poverty line or just near it is one of those factors that will help secure in some of these grants. Next slide. Now, here are some of the challenges for implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, a number of which has been touched on in previous sessions, including in the housing one. There's rising construction costs due to the military build, which is about to be kicked up a notch. The lack of construction labor. This has to do with a storied history over the last few years of federal denials of import of H-2 labor, and I'll sort of get to that. Global supply chain issues. If we're having difficulty finding them on the shelves of Payless, then the contractors are difficulty finding what they need as well in order to do construction. The Buy American provisions, all for the most part, federal grants have a Buy American provision, which means you can use that money, but only to buy stuff made in America, which is good and well and good if it's actually made in America. But to give you one example of the problem is that the Port Authority of Guam has been trying to secure funding to build 2 new gantry cranes. Problem is, no one in America builds gantry cranes anymore. So there's no place for them to use the money for. So it's one of those issues to work into. But generally speaking, it's one of the estimates is that the Buy American provisions adds 30% increase in material costs over equivalent available local products, which is kind of easy to figure out since we're now at the footstep of Asia, and the continental U.S. is, you know, almost half a world away. Then, of course, there are the increase in oil prices and contributing to higher construction costs. You know, aside from the impact on consumer, its projected affect shipping rates, and also the bottom line for operating construction equipment from contractors. Next slide, please. Here's something else that has to be taken into consideration. The chart before you is a DPW permitted construction for this fiscal year, or at least for the first 3 quarters of this fiscal year. And this covers not only public sector infrastructure, you know, road construction and GPA generators, but also private sector construction, renovations of hotels, IT needs plans for a new data center, you know, and other sort of enterprises. The bottom line, though, is that the total is $413 million of permitted construction. This represents a 30% increase over the average of the previous 3 years. And these are only based on numbers 3 quarters of the way through the current fiscal year. The lesson to be drawn from this one is as the economy recovers, private sector and public sector or local government sector construction activity is increasing at a pace. And again, competing for contractors, competing for skilled labor, competing for the materials that go into construction that have to be imported. Next slide, please. This slide was presented to you in the affordable housing panel, which was before lunch. And I'm returning to it here. Well, actually, I didn't know they were going to use the affordable housing panel, but in any event, I brought this up to reinvest the point. For this year and the previous year, military construction has hovered around the $500 million mark. In FY23 and FY24, it's going to hit $1 billion each year. This is not exactly a one-to-one matchup of it, but it does give you the long-term trend for military construction activity projected now. And I think this is even before they factor in as to what is going to be necessary for the Guam defense system. Next panel, please. Last I said, H-2 labor has a storied history, and it remains a major challenge for any construction, not just infrastructure. And in 2018, this is to give a chart of the path to where this is and where this is going. In 2018, there were 100% denials. They basically shut down the program. And in 2019, the National Defense Authorization Act provided an exemption for H-2B for military buildup related projects, so not everything. And in 2021, the NDA had an exemption to expand and include more support for civilian projects. I believe they sort of had to demonstrate that there was adversely impacted by the buildup or something to that effect. Now, 2022, this year, the NDA is still, as last I was informed, it's still informed by Congress, and they're working on extending the exemption to 2023. Expires in 23, and they're working on extending it to 2029. But they're also sort of working on, and if it doesn't work this year, Admiral Aquilino, the Indo-Pacific commander, says they'll get it in next year, is a plan to seek additional legislation to create some relief for all industries, or exemptions for all industries, and not just construction. So that's in the plan right now, to try to deal with this issue as we are dealt with, not just infrastructure, but construction generally, the sort of squeeze we have in the availability of H2 labor. And probably was good news for affordable housing as well. So let's get to the categories in the BIL. We'll start with energy. Now, there are a lot of programs basically built around the idea of resiliency and power grids. Some of that is formula. This first one here, preventing outages and enhancing the resilience of electric grid grants. This is about $4.2 million over the next 5 years, or $800,000 a year. This money will be funneled through the Guam Energy Office and will be subgranted to relevant projects. We're still on the early stages of that one. They haven't received the money yet, as far as I know. And the rest of this on this list, for upgrading our electric grid and ensuring reliability and resiliency, deployment of technologies to enhance energy grid efficiency, energy improvements in rural remote areas, long-duration energy storage and demonstration initiative, and joint programs. These are all competitive or grants. In other words, we have to develop the projects and we have to compete for them, and let's see if we get something or not. Another competitive grant front, just to draw attention to, is there's grants for energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements in public schools. This is a new one that came out just in the Inflation Reduction Act that became law yesterday. The other thing is, but it's among other programs. Another program I want to draw your attention to is this last one, Energy Storage Demonstration Pilot Grant Program. This is one of the things we've been talking about with Rebecca Respicio, the Henry people at the Guam Energy Office, and also people at the Guam Power Authority. I think John Cruz in his presentation here at lunch made some allusion to it. And this is an interesting program. It's like $355 million that will be awarded to just 3 grants. And we're talking with GPA about going after one of those grants. Next slide, please. The project we have in mind, and this was in John Cruz's presentation, is a standalone battery energy storage system, or a BESS, of about 75 megawatts. The idea is this. You have this storage facility, and in those low peak periods, it can store excess energy. So when you hit the high peak periods, you don't have to add on another generator or gen it up. You just tap this battery to do it. It's a way of, and you do this without imported fossil fuel to do so. So this is one of those demonstrations where the notice of funding opportunity is not out yet. Like I said, one of the key to these things is you got to figure out whether you can fit into the grant or not. But this is the sort of thing we're sort of looking at. A couple projects we're looking at finding ways and grants to funding is the Malolo-Aganda transmission line. This is basically boosting up the resiliency of the power transmission lines, starting from Malolo and going through the south to Agana. This is important not only for the resilience of the system for customers, but also it also gets a transmission system up to tap whatever solar energy is produced. I mean, it's not always as easy if you have a private solar farm or a community solar farm and you just sort of hook it up to the GPA lines. The transmission lines have to be upgraded to bear that load. And this project will help do that. Not to mention, it will help support in that area any IT development that might occur. Like I said, IT consumes a lot of broadband. It also consumes a lot of power. And so that's part of the idea. The other thing we're looking at, and there's a number of funding sources from this one, not just from purely energy-related stuff, but other programs which I'll mention later, is the pneumatic microgrid, whereby you upgrade the transmission lines and deploy production assets and actually produce power in the south instead of, say, producing in the north and central and transmitting it down south. An important feature for resiliency and something that that we in the administration are intensely focused on. Next slide, electric vehicles. So the appropriation for electric vehicles in the infrastructure investment, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, kind of is like this. It's about $7.5 billion. $5 billion that was formula funded to states with alternative energy corridors. Since we're not a state, that didn't go to us. The remaining $2.5 billion is split up into two discretionary funding programs. One of it is charging stations in local communities, as in parks or near gymnasiums or et cetera. That notice of funding opportunity is not out and is not expected out before the end of this year. It's a new program. I mentioned this to point out this is where a lot of this is. The feds are still figuring out exactly how to do this. And as a consequence, they're not yet teed up to accept applications. And so we're in the process of learning about it as it becomes development. Another funding program is a discretionary program, not a formula funding, but a discretionary program for alternative energy corridors. Now, Guam does not have any alternative energy corridors, but I've been advised by U.S. Department of Transport officials we can set one up. So we're going to explore that one as an avenue of also applying for that sort of funding source. The issue of charging stations, right now, if you got an electric vehicle, you get a charging station you do at your home. All well and good. However, if you live in an apartment, not so easy an alternative. And so that sort of speaks to the need for some sort of public access charging stations, either on easements or at facilities, et cetera. It also speaks to being creative as to what these charging facilities are. There are, for example, models of solar-powered charging stations that are relatively modular and easy to, in other words, you don't have to dig up like a half-acre of land to do it. You just kind of like can install it in a parking lot. The downside well, not the downside, they don't entirely meet the need because electric cars will will require more power than the solar battery can replenish. So in other words, those batteries will be changed. So it looks like these charging stations, if they're solar-based, will have to be a hybrid-based as well. And we do in public places. In any event, this sort of speaks to, and we're sort of moving in that direction, both GPA and the Guam Energy Office and my office, for an island-wide charging plan as sort of a precursor for all of this stuff. Again, sort of stuff that's under development. One of the programs by the federal government, and this is part of President Biden's set the goal to convert all federal, state, and municipal vehicle fleets to electric in the next 15 years. One of the incentivize is a program called the Clean School Bus Rebate Program from GPA. This is a program to replace school buses with electric buses or lower non-emission buses. Last Friday, Public Works filed an application to replace 25 diesel buses with electric buses. The rebate for the class of buses we're going after is about $375,000 per bus. Again, these will be new electric buses replacing old, aging diesel buses. The total amount of the application is about $9.375 million. Again, it was just applied last Friday. Let's see how this goes. This is also a new program, so we're going to. I think a lot of people at the federal end and the grantee end, or the grant applicant end, are going to figure it out as they move along. Now, speaking of electric vehicles, Public Works is not the only one looking at electric vehicles. The Guam Regional Transit Authority has been looking at electric vehicles and grant opportunities, some of which got expanded by the Inflation Reduction Act that became law yesterday. So they're looking at it. The Guam Police Department has been active discussions about the prospect of acquiring electric motorcycles for their motorcycle fleet. And for those of you who want to take a look at an electric motorcycle, the Sun Energy Motors has a booth out there with an electric motorcycle, and And if you can examine what I don't think it's going to be exactly that model, but if you want to take a look at an electric motorcycle, there's that. And like I said, a lot of this infrastructure stuff will be fueled by the private sector and fueled by incentives provided by the federal government. There is in the Inflation Reduction Act a $7,500 tax credit to buy a new electric vehicle. And there's a $4,000 tax credit to buy an old one. So there's that. Next slide, please. I have 10 minutes? Oh my gosh. Well, gee, I guess I talk faster when I practice this. Okay, moving forward through. Airport. They're getting $30 million in form of grant funding over the next 5 years. Next slide, please. Then there's the Airport Terminal Discretionary Fund. Again, this program is over 5 years, and so they're doing a number of active programs to do with the FAA on these projects. Next slide. We got all these bunch of airport projects they're going to go after and trying to get fund. One in particular mentions the terminal roof employment, which they're going through the design phase now and hopes to submit that next year. Next slide. Port infrastructure. Major grant programs are Port Infrastructure Development Fund, Marine Highway Program, the MEGA program, and the RAISE program, which is, there was a local commentator who remarked that this year's cycle, CNMI got $3 million out of this program, but Guam got nothing. However, the way these programs work here, you don't get everything every year. It's not a formula funding. And the missing part of that story is in last fiscal year, the Port Authority got a $22 million raise grant, and CNMI got nothing. So, just as a matter of context how this works out with other programs. Port projects, they have about $118 million projects going to go after the existing programs. Next slide. Those are a lot of the programs. Next slide. Surface transportation. There are about $45 million in highway projects already in place now, or ongoing now, based on existing funding. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides $96 million in federal highway funds over the next 5 years. Of that, $10 million is already committed to projects, which leaves roughly about $86 million open. Next slide. Oh, no, so go back to this. I want to mention a couple other things. Guam Highway Fund, this is otherwise known as the Territorial Fund. This is a fund fueled by the liquid fuel taxes. It's about a couple $1 million normally. However, with the liquid fuel tax relief passed here, the funding for this one is sort of uncertain, but hopefully we've drawn out to normal. Federal transit, those of you who put public transportation as the top priority, it will get $11 million in the next 5 years. We're going to take a look at the RAISE grants. If anybody wants to take a look at what kind of highway projects DPW is looking at, Google Guam 2030 Transportation Plan, and basically they take the projects off that list, and that will give you a sense of what it is. Unfortunately, the public transit portion of that thing is in my view, kind of embarrassingly vague, but Richard Abana, the current general manager, is working on that. Wall equality initiatives, next slide. Normally Guam gets about $8 million from the Clean Water Act State Revolving Fund. They've added another $26 million to that, so we're going to get $170 million over the next 5 years. Some of that money has been specified for a couple clear courses, like one is lead pipes, but we don't really have a lead pipe situation in our system. We're not Flint, Michigan. There may be a problem with lead pipe fixtures, but not with lead pipes, but that money can be perhaps redirected to other water and wastewater purposes. What is also set aside in a looming issue is PFAS and PFAS remediation. I won't go into that deal. Next slide. One of the projects that has been identified to use that money for is the Gilbree subdivision. This is one of those subdivisions where they sold it to the families here without supporting infrastructure, and it cost us roughly about $4.7 million. One of the ideas is to use that funding to actually install water infrastructure. Next slide. One of the things you're talking about obscure programs is that these rate of programs from the Bureau, of all places, the Bureau of Reclamation of the Department of Interior. And as it turns out, there are a number of things this can be used for, including building wells, and there's another project on the offing for Ugam River that you can apply this funding for. And as far as I can tell, I don't think Guam has ever accessed this funding. One of the reasons is that there's a 50-50 match. However, the Inspector General's Office, the Interior Department has issued a ruling that for the territories, no local match is required for any Department of Interior program. So therefore, we can access the money and not have to come up the match. Next slide. This includes the National Park Service grants, which are there to build parks and playgrounds and that sort of thing, not just to take care of the national parks. So including one of the programs which specifically mentions urban parks, so we're going to take a look at that. Okay, next slide. I mentioned the building resiliency, and I mentioned that a lot of the resiliency money was FEMA money to build resiliency, including the Building Resiliency Infrastructure and Communities program. Now, this funding and the other programs doubled in the bipartisan of the infrastructure law. Where we are in that process, this will come out in when the FY22 grants are announced next month. However, we're still waiting for the awards to come out from the 21. And that's crucial because we don't want to apply from a grant in the FY22 cycle if we already got the money in 21, but we don't know that. So this is one of those other issues to work with the feds and that. The other thing I want to mention here is there was FEMA adopted a new policy about 2 or 3 years ago where it identified a natural infrastructure that protects communities as available for FEMA funding, including the BRIC program, such as coral reefs. And so some of this money can not only be available for build infrastructure, but to help preserve the coral reefs. This is also true for the next 2 programs. The FEMA Hazard Mitigation Program, usually done for hard-hitting projects. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which is to deal with flooding. Next slide. This is a list of the broad range of some of the resilience programs. They go from diesel emissions to fish passages, for the Department of Interior. Next slide. Cybersecurity. There are at least 3 major programs to provide money to help protect public institutions and public facilities from cyber attacks. Next slide. We're going to get to the subject of schools. The Guam DOE School Facility Master Plan, recently issued, has identified $110 million in deferred maintenance needs and $140 million in capital improvement project needs. As my understanding is, all of the deferred maintenance projects and a good part of the capital improvement projects are fully funded right now. The Department of Education got close to about close to $400 million out of the American Rescue Plan, and about $175 million in blast support are been dedicated to school repairs. In addition to this, we have Simon Sanchez coming along that's expected to break ground next year. Now, one thing I wanted to mention about schools, the statistics show that in addition to Guam's population having declined by 3% based on the recent census, the public school enrollment is declining. So you have this situation of the projections for 2030 where there will be 13 under-capacity schools. On the middle school level, 2 are over capacity, 1 is under capacity, 2 high schools are over capacity, and 1 under capacity. So what that data infers is that for the future, as the population ages, which by the way is happening worldwide, not just here on Guam, it is likely we'll be consolidating the school facilities rather than build new ones. Next slide. Now this is the part where involve a lot of the activity of, how are we doing, Ginger? How much time? We're over. Okay. So this, like I said, my office will not be applying for any federal grants, and will not be, or I'll be directing any infrastructure projects. This is the exception on dealing with digital infrastructure. There are 4 main problems I want to sort of identify here. One is the Broadband Equity, Access, and Development Act. This is digital deployment. This is where you build broadband. Guam will get $1.2 million in planning money. And then from that, it will use that to develop projects to tap $25 million in money already reserved for Guam for infrastructure development. Now, in doing so here, the way this works is that the law establishes 3 priorities: unserved, underserved, and anchor institutions. And you get to the bottom one as you work through the priorities starting from the top. Now, what constitutes unserved and underserved? We based on FCC maps, which are not out yet, and because they had vendor problems, are not expected until the end of the year. FCC has already set out notice the ISPs to give the information. So when you have those maps, then you can figure out what's your underserved, what's your unserved, and what you have left available for anchor institutions, and from there you can develop projects. So that's kind of where that works. The other one is the Digital Equity Act. Unlike the BEAD program, which builds infrastructure, this is about digital equity programs. We're expected to get $150,000 in planning money. From that, we develop a state digital equity plan, and then using that, we can apply on a competitive basis for digital equity funding for things like digital literacy programs, skills training, Wi-Fi hotspots, access to devices by disadvantaged families, and by various capacity building. I'll give you a short story about this provision. This passed as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. When it passed and we met with NTIA officials, we were told Guam and the other territories would not be a part of this program due to a technical reason. And it came down to this. There was a separate approach for the territories at the end of the digital equity sections. When you go to the top, there was authorization to use this program for the states, authorization to use it for Puerto Rico, and no authorization for the territories. So therefore, the money was there, but we couldn't access lest a technical change from Congress. When I informed Governor Leongo from this one, she immediately got on the horn and went to the White House for a meeting, and has been strenuously lobbying for this for a good part of the year to resolve this issue. And a couple months ago, the Commerce Department was advised as well. They sort of lawyered this out, so we are now part of the program. This is the sort of things we have to work through. Affordable connectivity benefit. You've heard ads of this from a number of the internet service providers. Basically, for people who meet a certain income criteria, they get a $30 subsidy for whatever internet plan they have. You apply to the internet service providers, they get the subsidy from the FCC. Right now, my office has been in contact with the counterparts in the CNMI American Samoa, and we're going to try and increase that subsidy, or petition the FCC, petition the subsidy to $75, like tribal areas have. Another one is a small part of the bipartisan infrastructure law broadband program for middle mile. Basically, it's a connection of basic infrastructure to where you sort of do the drop lines to feed people here. The downside of this program is that there's a 20% match, and the minimum smallest program you can have is $5 million. So taking advantage of it means you have to come up with $1 million for every grantee applies. But we're sort of working on issues with the ISPs. And then there's the programs in the Office of Insular Affairs, a lot of which it goes for infrastructure. And one thing to draw attention to, this came from the Inflation Reduction Act, is climate change technical assistance. Now, I'm over, right, Ginger? Okay, so I was about to go into major mega projects, including the medical campus and Tejan Parkway. I will go quickly to Tejan Parkway just so you sort of, this is current estimates cost for $100 million. You can skip the slide. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Basically, here's the idea. You have that road that comes down from Dededo, and instead of veering up to that sharp triangle near the airport, you continue it down to where Home Depot is and turn that way into a four-way stop. And then from there, do a separate road, a wider road, that goes all the way and hooks up on the other side, where the Sunset normally does. This involves getting permission to use airport land. It involves acquiring private land for this purpose. There are funding streams that are identified that may could support this, but it's one of those major projects. So with that, and without necessarily going to the long story about the Guam Medical Campus, thank you all very much for your time. If you have any questions, we'll be available, my staff and I. Thank you.
Good information there. Thank you very much to Tyrone, and thank you for speeding up towards the end of that. So I don't want to take too much of our time away from the next panel, so we'd like to ask the next panel to come on up and join us. And I would like to invite Patrick Lujan. He is going to be the facilitator for the next panel. And at the same time that he's coming up, I would also like to invite up John Salas, Michael Macchio, Joseph Borja, and John Mark Joseph to join us. Our panel is going to be Stewards of Guam's Heritage, Respecting Our Lands, and Mitigating the Impact. And the person who is going to be moderating this section is Patrick Lujan. He was appointed the Guam State Historic Preservation Officer by the governor in June of 2019. It is his second stint at the office. He was the deputy head of that office from 2007 till 2010. He has spent almost 25 years in the government of Guam, working in managerial levels for the water and wastewater utilities, public health preparedness, and historic preservation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the microphone Patrick Lujan, and he will introduce his panel.
We are right, good afternoon. Let's stand up real quick. We'll do a ginger stretch. Go ahead, stand up. It's almost the end of the time, or luckily not the last session. Thank you for enduring this. We're almost done. So, okay, you guys don't need to stretch in the front row? You guys are good? All right. Okay. Well, before we start, my name is Patrick. I asked them to play that song, Lean On Me by Club Nouveau. How many of us were born when that was the #1 hit? All right, for those of you who weren't, you missed out. There's a little story behind that. We had a guest speaker at my school back in the day, 1986, 87. She was a reporter for Guam Cable TV. And so the next morning, it was like my first time I was ever came to close to fame, and I actually called her up she was doing morning radio news, and I called up and I said, "Can you ask Ray Gibson if he can play Club Nouveau?" And I was riding to school, and the request came about, and the song came on, and that was Ginger Crendon back in 1986, I believe. So then we became co-workers at KUIM, and look at now, we are all grown up here in 2022. So that's just a little side note. Today we're going to talk about, and you know what, we actually gave 90% of our time to Tai Taitono. That was on purpose, so every panelist has like 90 seconds to talk today. So, but seriously, we are here to talk about stewards of Guam's heritage, respecting our lands and mitigating our impact. Stewardship means it's an approach that we at the SHPO's office has taken great pride in, because basically that's what we're doing from a cultural and historical perspective. It is our job to oversee that our lands, what little left we have on our island, is looked at, monitored, and respected for everything that has been going on. We're talking about millions, billions of dollars the last couple of days, from not only on the military side, but also on the civilian side, right? There's just so much money, and all of these projects have to go through our office for approval, believe it or not. So it makes it a very daunting task for us, and the mission that we hold is we really hold it near and dear. There's two agencies that we always say, you know what, this project is held up at the SHPO's office. Luckily, we have Guam EPA to join us as far as holding up projects, so we're not alone. So thank you, EPA, for sharing that burden with us. Next slide, please. So very quickly, slide. All right, so for those, most of you know, most of us are planners in here. The SHPO's office runs off of federal and local statutes. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, that's where we based off of all the military, or the, well, not only military, but federal funds falls under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. Section 106 process is within that. And locally, 21 GCA Chapter 76, that's also something that we've been working in the last year or so to update it and bring it up to today's standards as far as archaeology, anthropology, and preservation, because that dates back also quite some time from a local statute that we're still having to operate off of today. So it's election season, so it's probably not going to happen between now and November, but hopefully next year we'd have an updated version of local statute. Slide. What is a SHPO? So it runs a gamut as far as cultural and historical perspectives. Review and compliance is our #1 thing. Section 106, like I mentioned, with federal funds. We review and comment archaeological plans. That takes some time. We facilitate human remains, discoveries, and reburials. The history of Guam has pretty much been rewritten, especially on the northern plateau within the last couple of years, with the building of Camp Bloss, where imagine finding one tooth turned into finding an entire burial of our Chamorro people, which has been, giving us another version of what we thought was taking place hundreds and thousands of years ago here on our island. The other thing on the human remains is that also falls under our office is the reinterment of all our ancestors who have yet to find their final resting place, and that's the project that we've been working on with the Nafta Maninata. So that project alone, we have remains. If everyone's familiar with the Hornbostel collection, these are remains that have been out of the ground for over 100 years, and we as a people have still not yet reinterred them. That's a big project. The design is completed. Rest his soul, Andy Laguatnia, who just passed away. That's probably what was his final project in designing the Nafta Maninata. So we will honor him once we find some funding and to proceed with that project. That will be up at Ipao Point, right above Hilton Hotel. We also do public outreach education, and of course our office is a data bank pretty much with dealing with historical cultural sites and all the archaeological surveys over the years. With that said, we will jump right into some panel discussions. We have major stakeholders behind me. We have the Regional Environmental Director from JRM, John Salas, who we work closely with all the federal and military projects that go on. Michael McKeel, Chairman, Guam Historic Review Board, and also a historic architect. He's with Taniguchi Ruth McKeel. John Mark Joseph, our state archaeologist, and of course Joe Barha, the Director of Department of Land Management. So real quickly, first up to talk about the SHPO's roles and how we engage with other agencies or other entities in regards to development and projects is Mr. John Mark Joseph. As mentioned, he's the state archaeologist of Guam since 2010. He holds a Master's of Art degree in anthropology from East Carolina University. He's a published author, photographer. He was also the state archaeologist in Saipan prior to moving to Guam. And he's been giving many numerous talks and papers. And he was instrumental in the changes of the 2011 programmatic agreement with the Guam buildup. Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss processes with the SHPO's office is our state archaeologist, Mr. John Mark Joseph.
Thank you, Patrick. Basically, what we do on the regulation aspect of historic preservation is through, as Patrick said, was 21 GCA Chapter 76 and through the executive orders there and Section 106. And as they kind of run parallel in the fact that both of them go through permitting processes if they're off land. On federal land, they're not, but they run through the Section 106 process. So in that, we start looking at the federal side. They look at their projects to see if it's having any impacts to historic properties, and then we look at those impacts, or they look at those impacts, and they make a determination on whether they will have an adverse effect or not, and then we start to mitigate them if they do. If not, they're allowed to go ahead. The same thing happens on the outside with the private industry. They bring in, hopefully, they get to us a lot sooner, and same way with the federal agencies, come to us as soon as they have an idea that they're going to have a project. That way we can start looking at it immediately to see if we can't, if there's any historic properties or whatever, to avoid those type of any adverse effects to them and to mitigate those adverse effects. On that aspect, so we like for our developers to get in quickly, let us know what they're doing, start looking and researching the problem there, and then going from there. And then we do what's called a certificate of approval that basically says that they have to take into effect the adverse effects that may be happening. And that's about it. But the main thing is to get to us early, whether it is a federal project or it is a local project. If you've got a project, come to us, let us see what it is. That way we can take care of the problem and get the work. We like things to run smoothly like water rather than stopping up like a dam once we hit adverse effects or burials or whatever it may be.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just to reiterate that, we're running a real small office as we speak. So the sooner you have a project, even if it's an idea and you know it's coming through, knock on our door and let us, get it on our radar. Our next speaker, he is the Regional Environmental Director for Joint Region Marianas. He's a homeboy, John Salas. He has a master's in Defense and Strategic Studies from U.S. Naval War College. He's also a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Seattle University. He began his engineering career in 1996 as a civil engineer at the Guam International Airport Authority before going to the dark side on the federal side. He joined the federal government with the 36th Civil Engineering Squadron in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, to describe the planning process for cultural resources on DoD property, Mr. John Salas.
Thanks, Patrick. So in the interest of time, I'll make my remarks brief. Did have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Tyrone Taitano, so he's really had a lot of good information to pass on, so I happily forfeited some of our time for him. So it's my hope this afternoon, being here sitting in this panel, because we've got different stakeholders that represents different equities towards cultural stewardship on Guam. So it's my hope that I at least daylight, some of the federal government's perspective in planning for these cultural resources consideration. And in terms of planning, this, planning is a pretty broad topic. And, Mr. Michael McKeel, being an architect, and a disclaimer, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an engineer. So from an engineering and an architecture standpoint, design and construction is pretty much our meat and potatoes in what we do. But inherently embedded in all the things that we do, design and construction, is planning. And specifically for cultural resources considerations, we really hone in environmental planning. And so from the federal government perspective, there's two primary federal mandates that we abide with, and that's the first is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. So this is, your big NEPA document. You've heard some of the environmental impact statements. Maybe it's a smaller action as environmental assessment, but this is the first bite at the apple, if you will, for the federal government to assess all environmental impacts associated with the proposed action. A subset of NEPA, and it's also independent in its own right, that John Mark Joseph and Patrick Lohan had alluded to, is the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, of 1966. So embedded in that is the Section 106 process. So under that act, the federal government, any federal government, including DoD, were mandated to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer. So with the Section 106 process, and it's a pretty well-prescripted process under 36 CFR 800 that really, there's four major steps. The federal proponent or action proponent needs to first notify the SHPO, so we're mandated to consult with the SHPO. Secondly, we need to identify historic properties that may be affected by our action. So when we identify historic properties, we basically need to either have our archaeologists or contracted archaeologists do cultural resource surveys to account for any historic properties. And then with that step, the federal government is obligated to demonstrate a reasonable and good faith effort. And the third step of the Section 106 process is to evaluate any potential impacts or adverse effects to these historic properties. So with that, once we've identified the historic properties, then the federal government really needs to look at, ways that maybe we could avoid these historic properties or maybe minimize impacts. And then, lastly, there's a consideration for any mitigation that needs to be performed because of our action. And then lastly is the decision. The decision lies with that federal agency in terms of whether they're going to go forward with the project or maybe alter the project and maybe cancel the project. But I will end with this, that I represent the Joint Region Marianas, and since my time working for the federal government, or in the dark side, as Patrick had said, that we're committed to protecting Guam's cultural resources. We are committed to exercise environmental stewardship, and we'll do what we can to work with all the pertinent stakeholders to ensure that we can balance mission requirements. So the Department of Defense has Title 10 authorities to execute national security initiatives in our region, but at the same time balancing those mission requirements with NHPA compliance.
Thank you, John. Just real quick, John, if you want to, this is just putting you on the spot, but over the years since Camp Blas has started, can you give us a rough estimate of how much DoD has paid for archaeology just on Camp Blas alone?
So I don't have a rough number, but I can tell you this, that when I started, maybe we only had 2 archaeologists and staff, but Camp Blas now has 3 full-time archaeologists, but that doesn't include the contracted archaeologists. So pretty much all the prime contractors that's assigned a construction project associated with Camp Blas, whether it's building one of the ranges or the main cantonment, that prime contractor has a subcontractor with a team of archaeologists at these sites.
And speaking of archaeologists, you guys all well know that they don't walk on the streets, right? It's hard to obtain archaeologists. During the build-up itself, they laid claim on most of the quality ones that we had on the island. And in a couple of weeks, like he said, there's 3 just on Camp Blas, there's a couple down at Big Navy, there's a couple over at Anderson, and they consider themselves spreading thin. In a couple of weeks, us on the Gulf Guam side will just have Mr. Joseph for the entire island. So it's a daunting task when we're dealing with our mission. Our next speaker doesn't need an introduction. Like Senator Perez said yesterday, we wish we can just put a thumb drive into his brain and download everything he knows. No introduction needed for the Director of Land Management. He's going to speak on the roles and planning for cultural resources on DLM's section, Mr. Joe Borja.
Thank you, Pat, and I promise to run over the time. Yeah, let's go ahead and put up the Naftan Maranata. Thank you for the segue, Pat, on that. And our topic here is a little bit of a misnomer. I think it said something like DLM role in planning for cultural resources. We're basically a reactionary agency when it comes to cultural resources. For example, in 1992, open up that file, please. That's when they decided to try and see if they can get a site for ancestral remains. And Naftan Maranata, for those of you that don't know, it basically says a burial site for our ancestors. And in 1992, under Public Law 21104, it establishes a Chamorro shrine. At that time, it was called. And then if we can just go down the files and open it up, please. Anyway, 1992, Public Law 21-104 establishes Chamorro Shrine. In 2000, there was okay, we can go now to 2000, speed it up. Ancestral Remains Task Force report, the 2000 document. And this was from the Hornbuster collection that Governor Gutierrez actually went to Honolulu to get from the Bishop Museum, brought him over to Guam. However, when we brought him over, we didn't have a place for it. And in 2001, the property known as Oka Point at that time, the old hospital, was given a public law, 25-179, and given to the Chamorro Land Trust for commercial development. Okay, the next one is 2003. There was a plan to have the reburial site down at the Chief Matapang Memorial Park, where Matapang Beach is now. And then in 2003, the Chamorro Land Trust and that administration decided to put out Ipaw Point, where the Odo Hospital is, formerly known as Oka Point. It's really Ipaw Point. They put out, okay, so we can go ahead and move down to 2003. So there was a request for development for Ipaw Point that was put out by the administration at that point. And let's go down to 2004. Now that's a PowerPoint presentation. So if you could just open it up and open it page by page. Slide by slide. I'm gonna get so much airtime on this conference. All right, let's go ahead and go down the slides there, as you can see. So there was a proposal at one time to develop Oka Point, Ipaw Point now. And if you can go down the slides, and I'll let you know when to stop. Some of those teal covers are to protect the innocent. And this was what the plans were for Ipaw Point at one time. So you can see the density there is quite a bit. Orientate yourself with the traffic circle there. But at one time, this was the development of Ipaw Point. So we can go down to 2013, a news article by Mariana's Variety. There was supposed to be a facility for ancestral remains. If you move down to 2015, file, more ancestral remains await burial. And then 2016, you can get out of the PowerPoint now, I'm going down by files. 2016, some Pago Bay remains still unburied. And then in 2016, Public Law 33-204 finally reserved land for a burial site for ancestral remains. And that was Public Law 33-204. And you can go down to the very last file. And that basically stated, the law said that we'll have the burial site up at Ipaw Point. And from there, they developed the Naftad Manaynata, which Patrick was talking about, the late Andrew Laguarnia presented. I believe that was his last project. So you can go ahead and open that last file. Yeah, so this is the plan for Ipaw Point. Of course, you have the traffic circle here. This is the Second Kuturan Chamorro, the former staff housing that we have here. And then this is the actual site for the ancestral remains, the Naftad Manaynata. The purple area is the facility itself. The green area is sort of a buffer zone. And we have here, I think it's GGN marker number 3, I believe, right, Survey Division? So we have a survey marker in the top there where that star is. There's also a fault line that goes to that property that we have here. So this took up about, I believe, 8 to 12 acres. So the only open area remaining now up at Ipaw Point is about 19 acres that belongs to the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, which under Public Law 25-179 is to be highest and best use commercial development. Usually in this area, highest and best use is hotel. So we'll take a look at it, but can you go down to the very last file there in that folder? And that basically shows Ipaw Point in 1994, the old hospital that was over there. So you can see mental health there in the old hospital and the big open area and the hotels. So that's kind of like one of our projects that involves planning or executing cultural resource protection, which is basically and the law says now, if you find ancestral remains, you bury on site. But as planners, what's the one site, what's the one project that you don't bury on site? If you're developing something and you find ancestral remains, and that something doesn't really allow you to bury ancestral remains. Landfill. If you're developing a landfill, and you're going in there to develop a dump and you find ancestral remains, you don't want to bury on site, right? So down at the Luzon landfill, on your way in, you will see a memorial there. That's where the ancestral remains that were found building Luzon landfill. I believe that may be the only one, maybe a missile site, don't bury them there, and other things like that. But that's one of the projects that land management works to plan or perpetuate the cultural resources that we have here. And I'll go to the next project there. Thanks, Pat, for the time. That would be O2 Symposium. And it's Hadja Hagat. Anybody been down at Hagat Way recently? Anyway, let's go ahead and show the first slide that we have. Thank you for your patience. Show the first file in that folder. Yeah, this is the Hadza Hagat area, and you can see that you can see that little thing up there that looks like a centipede. That's the Pagacho subdivision. And then across it, you have the marina. And then Hadza Hagat, as I call it, is this area right here. This area right here. This is the solid waste transfer station, and this is the Southern Sports Complex. So you guys know that Northern Sports Complex, built with FIFA money. This is being built with FIFA money, I believe, about $500,000. So they're going to have a complex down there that's probably, hopefully, equal to the Northern Sports Complex. And again, you have the solid waste transfer station. You got a 500,000-gallon water reservoir tank here. And this is the area that I'm talking about. Public Law 2218 reserves 20 acres in that property for a cultural center. But that property is about 202 acres. Included in that planning is Agate Elementary School, a post office, Southern Judicial Center, bus satellite station, and a couple of other things that are happening there. So this part of Hadza Hagat is basically looking at being developed, for community purposes. And one of those lots in there, 20 acres, is reserved for a cultural center, maybe similar to the Second Cultura and Chamorro that they have up here. So that's 20 acres. So we do have a role in the planning because that cultural center is going to go to the, it ain't going to look like that. We're going to have what do you call it, community centered over there. So land management will be in charge of that. But there are other facilities that are in there, and we're planning on that. So if you go to the following folder just below it. So these are the lots in that area. This is actually the lot that we're talking about, lot 480. There are some private properties around here, same as over here. And then you have the sports complex and the solid waste transfer station, the water site that we're looking at. Chamorro Land Trust has already given out about 70 leases on there. So we need to plan that out so that they don't start putting 1 acre lots, 1 acre leases in the middle of this big lot that would preclude us from developing a 20-acre cultural site or a 2-acre post office or a 15-acre school in there. And we're working with Chamorro Land Trust on that. But this part of Agat is developing, and so you've got a little bit of area here where Edwin has a lot to say about in that area. This lot, I believe here, is a planned development. It's set up for a hotel, approved in the 1980s. So, this is the southern part of Agat. That's why we call it Agat. So let's leave Agat and go down to Agania. The next folder. Now I put this one on because historic preservation, was involved in this. And this is the Department of Land Management building that was planned for down in Hagatna several years ago. And, okay, I don't know that file that says DS Store. I haven't been shopping on it, but no, don't open that one yet. John Mark Joseph doesn't know about that one yet. Okay, so let's go, yeah. So the property in Agania for the land management building, by the way, it's called the land management building by law, but the land actually belongs to the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. So it's not really land management's land. It will be when we get it built, land management building. So let's go right down to the folder or file right below it. So this is the map of the area, kind of like a nice big lot in Hagatna. Very hard to find big lots in Hagatna. So this lot in here used to have a lot of different smaller lots, and we worked with the private landowners, negotiating with them to move their property somewhere else. That's kind of like a hard thing to do. Hey, buddy, we need this land for a land management building, but we're not going to take your land, but can you move it over there, please? So we convinced these landowners who had property almost in the middle of this big lot here to move to the edges so that land management would have a nice big lot in the middle where all of our smaller lots have been consolidated into one large usable lot. And you can go into this lot, access it from O'Brien Drive, and you can access it from Hessler Drive. We can have a drive-through land management here because you have both sides of the property. So that's the property. Now, let's take a look at the next file below that numerically. Yeah, so about a couple of years ago, when this administration came into the office, we, the governor had the idea of developing Hagatna, and one of these was this. Nope, not that one, not yet, for John Mark Joseph. Okay, yeah, the MP4 file. It's not music. So in 2020, we worked with several agencies. One of them was Guam Housing and Urban Renewal, the late Ray Tapasna, developed this, I believe it's a drone shot of the property. And this is the property right here. It's right in the middle. Holali's over there. This is, I believe, the president's apartment here. And this is one of the employees at NAFAC, I think, lives there in that area. And this is O'Brien. So this property to the left, there's the actual site that was planned or proposed for the land management building. It's a nice piece of property. It's in Hagatna, and it's very close to Hulali, of course, and there we go. So that's Hulali over there, and then you have some commercial buildings here on this side. But it's very rare to find a piece of property this big in Hagatna, especially belonging to the government. So that was the proposed site. And we can go now down to the next slide, or next file below that. Yeah, so there was a proposal put up by Gura and the other stakeholders in the property in Guam ancestral lands. They had the money to develop a building down there, and it went so far as doing these things, you know. However, when we were developing this proposal, we looked back on the records and we found out that in 2009, remains were discovered in the property, and that's where, you know, the archaeological people come in. Remains were found on the property in 2009, and Hagatna being Hagatna, you know, it covers a couple of historical eras. One is pre-Lati for the villages, and then you have the war, you know, that came in there, and the wars happened, what is 70, 80 years ago now, so it's gone beyond the 50-year historical site on that. But during the planning of that building, when they were doing the archaeological investigation of that property, remains were found on that property. So of course that put a halt on the project, and the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, as well as land management at that time, was also having problems with the enabling legislation on the funding aspect of it. So that kind of killed the project, those two issues. In this particular one, somewhere on this report, Ray Topasna estimated the cost of the building to be $20 million. But recently at a budget hearing, we found out that something like this is probably going to cost $28 to $34 million. Originally, when it was planned, it was, I believe, $1 million a floor, and it was planned for 6 floors, so we're looking at $6 to $7 million. But now that has ballooned up to 28. Will it be ever built? I don't know. But this is just one example where archaeological, cultural resources concern delayed the project and possibly derailed it, you know. And this is a government project. I'm sure if some of you other developers, I'm sure, like Patrick said, and of course, as John Mark Joseph said, you know, get those applications in early so that it can be looked at and maybe not have to deal with something like this, or something like Mr. Salas said, maybe don't build it there if there's significant cultural resources. So that's where land management gets involved in these cultural resources thing. I know that a lot of people have been bringing up these concepts, abstract things. I thought I'd like to show you specific projects that may have been affected by cultural resources and what we have. So I yield the rest of my time, Patrick, to...
All right, thank you, Mr. Borja, for taking up as much time as Tyrone Taitano. With far less words. Last but not least, our next speaker, he is a principal architect with Taniguchi Ruth Mikio Architects, Chamorro and Hawaiian descent. He's been doing architecture and planning on sustainability programs in Guam and CNMI for over 35 years. He's done the architecture of Coast 360 headquarters, Guam Community College Learning Resource Center that achieved the LEED Gold certification. Always been an advocate, adaptive reuse and design for aging, officially a historic architect. He is a chairman for both the Guam Historic Preservation Review Board and the Guam Preservation Trust. He will be talking about the cultural, historical property of Atentano and the master plan that goes into that, part of the Guam Preservation Trust initiative. Mr. Mike McKeel.
Afade, everybody. Joe, do you remember who the architect was of that project you were just talking about? All right. Anyway, yeah, so Afade, my name is Michael Blas McKeel. I'll go quickly through this so you guys can get to your happy hour. I come from a large family with a lot of real estate professionals in it. And recently we had a gathering, and I made this statement. The value of land in the islands is more than just its ability to be sold and developed. The true value of land is in the island's ability to meet the needs of our people, growing food, providing recreation, wellness space, and places for us to practice our traditions. After I made that sentence, at the family gathering, all hell broke loose. My cousin, the real estate agent, fainted. My cousin, the mortgage broker, broke into the Hail Mary prayer out loud. So apparently I've broken some laws. Anyway, so we're here to talk about being stewards of Guam's heritage, respecting our land, and mitigating our impact. So I'm going to try to wrap it all up in kind of a neat little bow for everybody, right? Yesterday, during Jay Merrill's presentation, he said, that all sounds really great, but what does it mean? In its simplest terms, it means bringing cultural and heritage advocacy into island-wide planning. And it also means bringing the island's planning goals into cultural and heritage advocacy. So during Tyrone's presentation, which was amazing, I want to take that course, but during Tyrone's presentation, all those moments had interfaces that affect our culture. That layer has to be infused in the work that we all do as planners at every level, federal, local, public nonprofits, neighborhoods, down to the household, right? So one question is, how do we do that? First, we have to start listening to one another. When we are talking about cultural advocacy, people don't know what we mean. We have to speak each other's language. So I got 3 definitions for you. Traditional cultural properties. What is that? Sounds cool. In its simplest forms, it's the places where we historically practiced our traditions. So those are the places like Pagat and Magua and the burial sites. They're all over the island. What would be wonderful for our community is to organize ourselves and pointing out also that the Department of Interior already recognizes traditional cultural properties. So it's already a respected thing that has its own rights. Now we as a community on Guam can use this kind of opportunity to organize and define and decide where those traditional cultural properties are and what kind of protections they deserve. So it's a very simple and straightforward thing. When we talk about conservation, the other thing that I love to hear is like people talk about conservation areas. There's this other version of it though that is heritage conservation. And in heritage conservation, we're looking at saving the spaces, but not boxing them in. The idea isn't to conserve properties so nobody can touch it, nobody can get to it. The actual goal is to conserve property and preserve our historic sites and find ways for people to interact with it. We need to get the communities to those historic sites, those heritage sites. Why are we teaching our children about Seguian and Manengan in an air-conditioned classroom with Wi-Fi? We can take them there. We can have them experience, walk through, and be in a heritage location and feel that heritage location. So next slide. This is my Aidzu'us slide. Some of you already recognize this property. So in the left side, that is actually Dos Amantes. That's Two Lovers Point. Show of hands, how many of you grew up with the legend of Two Lovers Point? Show of hands. And that was my mother's reaction when I tried to explain to her, my 93-year-old mother, oh, they're going to build a resort in front of Two Lovers Point, and there's going to be a Ferris wheel. So yeah, I got the Aidzu'us look. But again, as Dr. Anita Enriquez and as Celine explained yesterday, they can only work with the laws as they are. They can only work with the codes and the regulations as they are. Part of our job in in protecting our lands and mitigating our impact is to make sure that our laws and codes and regulations evolve with our needs. So this was clearly a moment for us, a learning moment for us, because our needs and the laws didn't line up, and there it was. Now, the Department of Land Management and the Guam Land Use Commission were able to mitigate portions of this development. It ended up in its current iteration being a little bit smaller than it started out, and I don't know if the Ferris wheel is still there. But again, when we're coming together as a community, when we're trying to preserve our heritage, and when we're trying to mitigate our impacts, these are our learning moments. So we have to take things away from this kind of moment and say, all right, we need to have discussions with legislatures, with the executive branch. We need to talk about where we see Guam in the next 10 or 20 years and how we want our culture to be preserved and represented. Next slide. So this is my little peekaboo slide. The planning and activities of island-wide planning and heritage and conservation planning, they've both been going great. They're both building capacity. They are two separate lanes. It's time for us in heritage advocacy and cultural planning to collaborate in island-wide planning and in the federal planning exercises that are funded on Guam. It's time for us to stop thinking about cultural preservation as something that everybody else does. It has to be part of all the activities that we do in planning moving forward. We already know that that sustainability is embedded in our planning language now. So we have to take that same step and make sure that cultural advocacy and heritage preservation is embedded in all of our planning efforts. There's no effort that doesn't have a cultural aspect to it. We have to study that, learn it, and just approach it intelligently. Okay. Next slide. So there's a couple of examples of the types of planning activities that have gone on. Several of them have been discussed today, right? So we all have heard about the Inarajan, the Inalahan Historic District Revitalization Plan, which was taken on by GPT. We also have the ongoing preservation plan that is being put forth by Patrick and his team. So again, what we were talking about one moment ago is, when are we going to find these opportunities to jump into those issues and explain to the community, explain to the policymakers what it is that we desire? We're in those moments. We're in those moments right now. So the preservation plan is being prepared by Patrick and his team. So communicate with Patrick and his team. If traditional cultural properties is something that you're interested in and you think it needs to be incorporated into our island-wide planning process, then say so. Next slide. One other thing I forgot to say, which is really that the Guam Preservation Trust has just wrapped on the community outreach component of their 5-year strategic planning exercise. And in that case, what they did was they did the outreach through educational groups, through architecture and engineering and construction and developers groups, through historians, and through planners all around the island. So it's that kind of outreach. But remember, you have to participate in it, and it's not a one-time thing. If you attend the strategic planning session, or if you're communicating with Patrick and his team about what you think the priorities are for heritage conservation, preservation, it's an ongoing process. It happens, it could happen many times during the year, and you have to be prepared, you have to be educated, right? I notice we have a lot of our friends here from the Northern Marianas Islands, and when we were talking earlier about programs where people think I don't even want to say they think outside the box anymore. They're thinking where they're supposed to. They're looking at their development not just as buildings, not just as roads. They're thinking about it as these entire systems. So today I know we have folks from the Northern Marianas College here, and up on the screen I've put up a little bit of information about their CREES program, and this is their research, education, extension program that they're practicing, and it is actually in effect on Saipan, on Rota, and on Tinian. But look at the things that they're focusing on. Look at the subjects that they're focusing on. Agriculture and food program. That's a priority. And it should be a priority for all of us, right? We need the roads, we need the infrastructure, but we need agriculture programs too. Look at that. Family communication and youth development programs. Absolutely, we need that. So that also has to be part of how we look at being stewards of our land, is thinking about it as more than just some place that we're going to sell and develop. They have nutrition and health programs. And again, one of the beautiful things about the CREES program that's, that Northern Marianas College is promoting is that it doesn't just take place in buildings. It takes place outdoors on the land. They've got aquaculture, natural resource programs, and the reason that I love this was because we talked a moment ago about Atentano. Atentano is following a very similar model. So Atentano it's a valley, and it has a river running through it, it has wetlands, it has historic resources. So what I said at the beginning was we have to find a way to connect the community with that space. We have to give people, the community, a reason to go there and interact with that space. That's where they'll learn. That's where the traditions and the culture will be promoted, preserved. Next slide. So, and this is a slide of Atentano and a couple of the folks here. So again, it's a very interactive program, and actually down below is also part of the Atentano ceremony that was just recently held. But it's a beautiful valley, and again, the intention is to master plan it. We're talking about things like archaeology, wetlands, aquaculture, paths, hiking, wellness, recreation, amutsiha. All of that stuff is in this program. So this is what we want to do when we are trying to be good stewards of our land, not just think of ways to sell it. Thank you. Last slide.
Thank you, Mike. Just an off note on that is, planning. What I've seen in the government is that we've gotten better at implementing culture and historical resources into our master plans. And we just got to keep doing that and keep doing better. Whether it's a forestry plan, whether it's a homeland security plan, I know we've been implemented as appendixes into these master plans, and we just got to keep engaging with that. Joe Borja will be here until 7 o'clock if you guys have any questions, but that's it for our panel. Thank you, and have a good week.
Sorry about that. It all kind of cascaded. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. This usually happens last day. Lots of really good information and not quite enough time. So we're going to ask the presenters for our last section to please approach the stage. We saved one of the most interesting panels for last, of course, to hold everyone's attention. It's going to be on agriculture and aquaculture. So I would like to ask David Crisostomo, an extension associate in aquaculture, to come up along with Frank Roberto, who is a biologist from the Department of Agriculture, and Melvin Tabilas from the Guam Economic Development Authority. And I will just give a few quick words on David, who is going to be facilitating. David received his bachelor's from the University of Washington in fisheries science, and he has a master's degree from Texas A&M, also in fisheries science, with an emphasis on aquaculture. He joined the University of Guam Cooperative Extension Service in 1980 and received his tenure before retiring in 2007. He's been really active with Sea Grant. He's on the governor's, he's the chairperson of the governor's Agriculture, Aquaculture Task Force, and knows just a lot about the subject. So, David, please take the mic and introduce your team.
Half a day. Thank you for all of you staying for the best session, because you know what the coordinators think is save the best for last. And so we're here to give you a little bit of an idea of what the aquaculture industry is like and some of the planning efforts to move aquaculture forward. And the reason that aquaculture is so important, it's a food industry. And what has been mentioned is that food security is very important. We all know our vulnerabilities out here in Guam, particularly with transportation. Anything can set it off, and we'd be in a hard place looking for food. So food security has been a major issue in the last several years at least, and it continues to be a focus. And so I'd like to, at this point, let you know that our session is going to be a little bit of a hybrid session. I will be the facilitator. I'll also be on the panel to join Mr. Melvin Tabilas, who is the special coordinator or special projects coordinator for the Guam Economic Development Authority, and Mr. Frank Roberto, who is a biologist with the Guam Department of Agriculture and does a lot of their aquaculture activities. Can I get the next slide? Okay, so in aquaculture development, we need a plan, and there have been many plans. The earliest one maybe in 1980, I believe, or 82, aquaculture development plan. There was another one in 2010. This past year in March was recently a feasibility study conducted and by the Economic Development Authority. And all of them basically said the same thing. Guam has great potential for aquaculture. Guam needs this, and this. Many of it were the same items, including a hatchery, including more research facilities, including more funding, including help with permitting issues. And all of those issues have remained the same. They've been attempted to be overcome somewhat in the past, but there's a lot more focus right now. Next slide. So as we look at planning for the future, we always want to look way ahead when we plan. And I was kind of set back in my seat a little bit by some of the local stakeholders who I really appreciate, because they came up to me and they said, look, what's the use of going forward and looking at these great ocean cages that you see up there? And I think that is really the future to go. But we need to not dismiss the current assets that we have, not dismiss the current producers, many of which need a lot of support. We have a lot of producers that are out of production and need a way to get back into production. They're very interested in doing that. And so our focus has been projecting for the future, but not forgetting our current situation. Next slide. All of us up here have to develop individual plans within our respective agencies. The University of Guam Sea Grant is no exception. And so this is just a little listing, not complete by any means, but I'll show you some of these as I go along. Our workshop series, we've done a few of those. We'll be doing many more in the future. We have a backyard aquaculture program that started about a year ago, and it incorporates several nonprofit groups throughout the island, 4 nonprofit groups in particular. And then we are planning towards a certification program because we want to increase this community backyard aquaculture program to include many more families and community groups. And then we have more of the advanced culture systems that we want to address a little bit later in the future, probably a year or 2 from now. And then again, permitting has always been an issue, and we'll be addressing that as well. So some of the requirements that we've seen for doing a planning effort include all of these. Your stakeholders are your primary requirement. If you don't have input from the outside, you'll just take your skewed view, personal view, and plan for that. And all these other areas, support and partners, prioritizing things, getting your resources and your assets. If you can include all of those in your plan, you'll have a much, much better plan. Excuse me. One of the greatest things about aquaculture nowadays, because I was in aquaculture since 1980, and the support was not there. There was a lot of verbal support. But since I've come back into aquaculture with the Sea Grant program in 2020, we have seen a tremendous boost in prioritization and support given not only at the local level, but at the federal level. And so this was a really boost for everybody involved in aquaculture. So a lot of funding, which is really critical. There's a lot of word prioritizing and word support, but if there's no actual funds sitting in place to help these things move along, they're not going to happen. We have a lot of local government support. This administration has prioritized aquaculture. They've developed the Aquaculture Task Force, or actually Aquaculture Task Force, and I chair that currently. There's also the Economic Diversification Working Group, which is a larger group under the governor's office, and the Aquaculture Task Force is a member of that. In that Economic Diversification Working Group, we were able to, or the governor provided some funds that all of these working groups could work with. And so realizing that aquaculture needed an awful lot of help, I was not very shy in submitting my budget. And it was approved. The governor was very, very supportive and displayed that in approving that budget. Next slide. So we have a number of partners working with us besides GITA and Department of Ag. Department of Education is also very interested in aquaponics in the school system and are making a push right now to include aquaponics in the elementary, middle school, and high schools. And so we're working together with them to do that. EPA and Army Corps of Engineers are critical partners because they kind of control and do the permitting and regulations. Like I said, there's a lot of resources and assets available. The feasibility study most recently done is a major guidebook right now for planning aquaculture and moving things forward. There is also a feasibility study, Frank may talk more about that, the Department of Agriculture is looking to start and contract, and that's more on the fisheries side. We have the Aquaculture Development and Training Center, also called the Fidean Hatchery, and that has a lot of value. It's being right now a public-private partnership with a private company to do the disease-free marine shrimp. The Marine Laboratory, of course, everybody knows about. That's kind of our shining star in Guam in terms of marine research. And then the Sea Grant Aquaculture Program, which just started when they hired me on 2 years ago. And so I'm pushing to try to get that moving, and there's a lot of support going that way. We'll see a lot more things happening there in the next year or so. Okay, as I mentioned, all these plans got to incorporate the current industry needs. And the current industry is nothing like the future that we're projecting, but it's going to be something that's going to be there always. These older ponds, which were built in the 70s and 80s, they're dirt ponds, they're called earthen ponds. They've always been looked upon as being an environmental detriment and a polluting factor. In fact, it probably was when it was built and operated in the 80s, but they can be revamped. We are looking at revamping those ponds and adding in safety factors to mitigate the environmental effects. So storage ponds and things like that for the effluent waters and a lot of more plant life. So we're kind of going back to the very old ways of doing things, but in a more modern context. So this would be what a typical earthen pond would look like. And if you drive down south, you may still be able to see some of them in the Talafofo area down in Inarahan. and our southern soils do really well for these kind of ponds. Some of the future systems that we're looking at take us out into the ocean. And there's been a lot of concern that while these ocean cages are just going to pollute our marine environment. But the technology has come so far that these ocean systems have been studied quite extensively. And we know that if you site them in a particular area with just the right amount of current going through, you won't get any deposition of waste material on the bottom of the ocean, that it'll all wash away and it'll get up in the current. And there's also other new technologies called integrated multi-trophic marine aquaculture systems. That's a mouthful. But what that basically does is surrounds your fish culture net with other organisms like seaweed, like oysters and clams. And those are all organisms that filter elements out of the water, either waste products, solid waste, or chemical nutrients out of the water. Okay, I told you we had introduced this community-based aquaculture system, and it's something that my boss, Dr. Shelton, had hit me up with as soon as I came on board. Was like, I want these aquaculture systems in the community. And I said, okay, great. I said, how do you want it? He said, that's up to you. So I said, okay, we got to learn to walk before we run, so this is a very basic concept of an aquaculture system, and the cost for it 2 years ago was about $3,000 per system. The cost for it now would be about $6,000 per system, and that's got nothing to do with the materials itself, primarily shipping and those kind of factors. But it's a very simple system that the 4 NGOs that now operate these are able to bring in their clientele, their community, and they work on these systems regularly. And we have had 2 of the NGOs already make some harvests, and so we're kind of excited about that. They've gone through it. They made a few mistakes, which I fully expected them to make, but they got through it, and they harvested fish, and they actually ate some, and they loved it. One program, the Guam Sustainable Culture Program, had a youth agricultural or kind of summer camp called Little Sprouts, and they introduced the kids to this system as well. And so the kids were able to harvest some fish at the end of their program before they left the program and go back to school. And so they all learned a little bit about it, and I expect to see them coming back probably next summer and go on and move on. We will be adding a plant component to this, so it will be an aquaponic system, and very easily adjustable to that. Okay, so these are the 4 NGOs that have participated or are currently participating in the program. And once we get the aquaculture budget all the way through, it's coming through from GIDA through an MOU over to UOG, we expect to expand this out to maybe 20 more participants having systems like this, or maybe slight modifications of these systems. Some of the other things that the task force budget will help us to do is to work with these private farms that are not in production in a on-farm demonstration type of thing, more than really a private-public partnership, but to demonstrate on their farms ways to amend their effluent discharge, ways to stop their effluent from polluting the environment. Not only because it's written in law, but we have to be self-conscious. We have to take the responsibility that we want to make this happen, and we want to keep our environment clean. This is our land. Also, we will be looking at, some of the farmers one of the big concerns is a hatchery. Everybody, whether you're farming crops or you're farming fish, you need to have seed to put into your pond or seed to put into the ground. And so a hatchery, in some cases, is a very simple thing, and tilapia being one of the biggest items being cultured, can easily have their own hatchery on each farm. So we're looking at that to also be something that we can do with this budget. The Department of Ag, Frank may tell you a little bit more about their plans when their budget, but they will increase their services and capabilities. And then getting on into new technologies will not be the initial thing we do, but it is something that we will definitely want to do and look at some of these other systems, not necessarily ocean-based systems, but some land-based systems and recirculating type of systems that use this concept I mentioned of the integrated multi-trophic capabilities with saltwater. So instead of having only fresh water, which is what typically Guam has had in the past in aquaculture, we may have some salt water, so raising rabbitfish, raising oysters, raising seaweed, so we can get seaweed back out on the market. I don't know when the last time any of you have had local seaweed, but nobody goes out and harvests seaweed anymore. And it's because of the toxic event of 2010, somewhere around there. Okay, so that'll end what I have to talk to you about. I'll turn this over now to Mr. Melvin Tabilas from GITA, and he can talk about his activities.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to build on what Dave has talked about and focus on GITA's role in all of this. We are the co-chairs of the Governor's Aquaculture Task Force. And so we've been partnering Dave quite a bit. He's on my speed dial. We are also leading, playing a leading role in the Governor's Economic Diversification Working Group. And then we also develop and implement the comprehensive economic development strategies for Guam. And so this is pretty important in that the SEDS, the projects that are incorporated into the SEDS qualify for federal funds under the U.S. Economic Development Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce. And it also makes it a lot easier to get other funds from other federal agencies. Now in these capacities, GITA in the last couple of years has accomplished a few things. So as Dave mentioned, we put out a aquaculture feasibility study through an EDA grant. And I'll talk about some of the recommendations there. So we completed that earlier this year. We also, while we didn't ultimately get it, we did apply for another EDA grant that focuses on a concept for a Pacific Blue Region economy, Pacific Region Blue economy, and that's in partnership with CNMI, Palau, FSM, and the Marshalls. And so, while we didn't get it, it's something that we do want to continue to focus on and to really look into building a regional aquaculture industry. And then we've actually, I've been having conversations with the Western United States Agricultural Trade Association, where I serve as the Guam rep, as the state marketing officer. And while, the focus obviously for aquaculture is going to be on food security, WSADA, the conversations with WSADA is to focus on them supporting opportunities for us to eventually export, maybe to the region. And then based off the feasibility study and the Pacific Region Blue Economy concept, we're collaborating with UOG, who is taking the lead and looking for additional funds, including potentially working with University of Hawaii and the national labs across the country. Now, a specific recommendation from the feasibility study is on developing the Guam Aquaculture Innovation Center. And Dave talked a lot about all the different things that the components necessary to build a aquaculture industry, and the Innovation Center will encompass all of that. So it would include a research facility, it will include a hatchery for seed stock, it will include a commercial development park that will serve as an incubator, an accelerator for aquaculture-related ventures. So the way that would work would be a master permitted facility where we would sublease portions of the property for these potential entrepreneurs. The Innovation Center will also support workforce development, aquaculture technology and things like that. A second thing that we want to do eventually, possibly after developing this innovation center, would be to look at some sort of logistics facility, shipping and logistics facility, to facilitate the movement of aquatic products to the region. And then again, the big picture, I think, for GITA is to really look at building a regional aquaculture industry with Guam as the hub. So that's all I got.
Thank you, Melvin. So let's turn it over to Frank now. Is that mic on?
Hi, half day, everyone. Are you excited for my presentation? Or is it because it's the last presentation? All right, let's keep that excitement. We'll finish strong together. So I'm here to talk about strengthening Guam's economy through aquaculture from the Department of Agriculture and the Fisheries section. Next slide. So here's just a video of Guam. Just, look how beautiful it is. I love looking at drone footage of Guam. I can watch it all day. But not only is Guam beautiful on the outside, but it's also very beautiful on the inside. It has a lot of very rich natural resources that has sustained us for thousands of years, and our agency just wants to cultivate those resources towards ensuring food security for our island. So if you haven't met me before, I always like to talk about how my culture always influences everything that I do, especially being a scientist today. So when I was, I'm still a grad student at UOG, so I did my thesis on aquaculture and rabbitfish and using tilapia to catch rabbitfish and grow it. Next slide. But for here at our agency, I kind of want to go into our sense of community as fishermen and fishers, that we work together to kind of cultivate the ocean so that we can survive. Next slide. So I wrote a grant along with Dr. Biggs, our assistant chief. We got $113,000 for a project called NatBoca, Battling Hunger Through Community-Driven Aquaculture Projects. And basically this is an extension, a cooperative extension project in which we bring tools from other regions or other places, and we give it to the community so that they can do their own projects. And that's a form of technology transfer where we're taking the techniques from other places and applying it for Guam and see if it's successful. Next slide. So for this community-based aquaculture project, we wanted to use Hema, or the giant clam. It's a very important commodity in Guam. Not only is the meat useful for food, but we also use the shells in a lot of our carving. It's a raw material for us to use them for tools and for body ornamentation. And it also has a global value in cuisine, and it's an attractive aquarium animal. Next slide. So this project was inspired by a pilot project that Department of Agriculture collaborated with the University of Guam to take 16 clams from UOG and transplant them to Inalahan pools with the 4-H youth as kind of like a pilot program to see, or just to kind of get it out there. Like, we want to work with the community to do these types of aquaculture projects and see how well they work out. Next slide. So here's some more drone footage of the event. We had, like, I think 20 kids, and we gave them, we grouped them together and we gave them each a clam or some type of marine animal that would survive in this water, and they planted it themselves. So they kind of had a sense of ownership to this project because they're the ones that planted it themselves. So this is what we want to do. We want to reach out to the community and work with them so that we're able to make these projects a little bit more successful because of that sense of ownership with the community. And there we are, future scientists. Next slide. So the project objectives, the first objective is just cooperative extension. Basically, we're bringing the tools over and we're gonna give it to the community, and we're gonna oversee the project as well. to see how well this project will work out. Our second objective is to train our HEMA ambassadors. So basically there will be 10 students from the 4-H program, and they'll be trained in observing these clams' growth rates. So we're going to be bringing in 1,000 clams from Palau, and we're going to farm them in open cages on the shore and observe their growth rates to see how well they survive in our waters. And at the end, after 12 months of observing their growth rates, we will collect the adult clams and harvest them, and we'll use their meat in a clam tasting event at the end, and it'll be with the community. And it's kind of showcase like using the meat for food, and also we'll have local artisans to carve out the shells and just show how we use each part of the clam. Next slide. So the first time that we did this was with the mayor of Inalahan. He was very supportive with this project. So he's going to be one of the 2 villages that we will be working with to have clam enclosures in their waters. So we're going to have Inalahan and Malesu as our 2 project sites for the clam enclosures. Next slide. So the first site will be near Inalahan Pools. Click, please. So in that part of Guam, that's where our first site's going to be, and then our second site, please click, will be in Malesu or in Cocos Lagoon. Please click again. And around that area. As far as surveillance goes, we do have funds to install cameras. We also will be having town hall meetings so that we can have the community aware of what the project is and have them be on the lookout. And this being a pilot project, we're just going to see whether it's successful or not. We're going to see if people are able to respect the project or if it's just going to be vandalized. Next slide. So the HEMA ambassadors will be measuring the clams in this way. It'll provide a hands-on experience for them, and just getting them introduced to the scientific process, and just kind of trying to spark that interest with these youth, so that when this project is over, hopefully we inspire someone and they want to continue. Next slide, please. So the interns will be paid a stipend of $100 a month for the 12-month internship, and we will be overlooking all of the activities that they will be doing. We, as in me, the principal investigator, and the principal investigators, Cliff Kyoto from the 4-H program, and Dr. Biggs, our assistant chief. Next slide, please. So the event that I was talking about, it's the third objective, and it's the last thing that we'll be doing for the project, which is where most of the outreach is going to be taking place. So I included the Giant Clam Ocean Culture Manual because we'll also be doing some induced spawning with the clams so that we can create a brood stock here in Guam for them. And I just forgot to say that earlier. So, and then these are just examples of what we'll be using the shells to carve, or what will be made from the carving. Next slide, please. So with this project, we just want to directly involve the community with this type of project and spark interest. They'll also gain some kind of meaningful experience with this project, and hopefully reconnect our youth with the environment and their culture. And we want to provide products from this project that are ecologically, economically meaningful, but also culturally significant. Next slide. Another project that we have is the aquaculture feasibility study. It's very similar to what Gita did, but with this one, we're going to determine whether or not an inland or in-water system is feasible for Guam. Next slide. So there are different systems that we have in Guam, and what we're doing with this project is we're just collecting data to see what available resources do we have in Guam, how much does it cost, and we'll make that information available to the public so that it can contribute towards aquaculture development in Guam. Next slide. What are some future projects that we have? A large-scale community-based aquaculture program. So basically what we're doing with the Natboca project, but we want a larger scale project. And as Dave mentioned earlier, integrated multi-trophic mariculture system. Basically, I'll explain that later in another diagram. And also another project that we're looking into is utilizing spawning aggregations as a natural rootstock source of fry or recently hatched fish. So basically we want to target these spawning aggregations and maybe collect some of the fry so that we can use it for grow out in our aquaculture systems. As we mentioned before, a hatchery is very important because we need seed in order to have grow out for these aquaculture systems. So the spawning aggregations could be a natural way in case we're not able to induce spawning in the lab for certain species. Next slide. Another project that we have is called the Agradasi Gadao. So we'll be releasing 700 Gadao in our MPAs and outside of the MPAs. So this project is more like a restocking project, and this is a way to see how effective restocking is in Guam. And restocking is one of the end products that we want for our aquaculture projects. Next slide. This is a general schematic that I created just to kind of envision what the integrated multi-trophic mariculture system would be for Guam. And I would want most of the species to be native species, and this just kind of shows the nutrient flow to kind of explain how it will prevent some adverse effects on the environment. Next slide. So in closing, I just want to emphasize that these pilot projects they're essential towards developing aquaculture in Guam. We cannot just do it on our own. We should have the community involved so that when everybody's aware of what DAR's role or what the government of Guam's role is in these projects, they'll kind of maybe be a little bit more respectful towards the projects. We want to diversify and expand our aquaculture projects, such as using the spawning aggregations as a natural broodstock for our aquaculture systems. And the direction that we want with aquaculture is to cultivate marine resources for economic benefit and restocking. So not only do we want to satisfy our economic needs, but we also want to satisfy our community needs by not only providing food or commodities for our market, but also providing fish to wild populations so that we can restore those populations so that we can still continue our traditional fishing methods. Next slide. Suzus Masian, thank you.
All right, thank you, Frank. So that's sweet and short, and we'll turn it over now so we can proceed with the rest of the program. But thanks for staying for the best session.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Another round of applause. Very good. Thank you, guys. So I know everybody has had a great time today. There's been a lot of fantastic information. I really want to thank all of you for being so wonderful, for sticking around. Thank you to everybody online who has been here for it. And to close out our program this evening and send you all safely on your way for a couple of housekeeping duties, I'd like to call up the administrator of the Guam Coastal Management Program, Edwin Reyes, who's done a fantastic job. Everybody give him a big round of applause. It's been a great program.
Thank you very much, Ginger. So I apologize, our director, Lola Leon Guerrero, is not able to be here to give her closing remarks, but I just want to give a special thanks to Ginger Cruz for being our mistress of ceremony. She has graciously showed up to this event to give back to us, and so we're very, very pleased that she was able to do this event pro bono as a way to kind of show her love and appreciation for the territory as well as for the Bureau. So thank you again, Ginger. At the beginning of this event, we talked about the CZMA, the Coastal Zone Management Act, And at the heart of the CZMA is healthy ecosystems, vibrant economies, and resilient communities. And I think the discussion over these past 2 days really provided some good ideas that we can integrate into the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan. So that's going to be the opportunity where we can then develop these policies, and we can make sure that we're going to work together to achieve a common goal. Some of the interim actions that we're going to be doing as a Bureau is to distill some of the conversations into actionable items in which we can then look to the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act funding opportunity, as well as develop private-public partnerships. So that's the kind of our next steps as a Bureau, and we really want to close this by thanking all of you for being a part of this. So on behalf of BSP and the Guam Coastal Management Program, thank you for your attendance. And before you go, we'll queue up the evaluation slide. So if you could just spend a few moments before you leave to give us some valuable feedback. Thank you.